It's an honor today to introduce the work of Professor Regina Grafe, a historian whose scholarship has reshaped how we understand economic life in the early modern world. Her career has been defined by her willingness to question inherited narratives, to follow evidence across continents, and to rethink the very categories through which global economic history is written. Professor Grafe has had a distinguished career path that in some ways maps some of the routes that she has traced in her research within Europe and across the Atlantic. She's been a member of the universities of Cologne, the London School of Economics, Oxford, Northwestern, the European University Institute, and now Cambridge in her varied career, as well as many visiting fellowships elsewhere. Her career productively draws on and I think knits together these quite different academic cultures in a way that is very exciting for us to have her as a colleague. She's also moved between posts in economic history, Latin American studies, and early modern history, making her well-rooted in these diverse subfields of historical research. She began her research in the early modern Iberian Peninsula, but her focus has soon widened to encompass the broader Hispanic world. She's traced the financial and commercial expansion of Spain from the 16th to the 18th century, examining how goods and people and institutional knowledge and practice move between places such as Cadiz, Seville, Mexico City, Lima, and a host of other locations. And what distinguishes her work is not just the breadth of all of these places, the geography that she's working within, but the clarity and revisionism that she brings to the debates she's addressing. She challenges ideas of smooth economic integration or inevitable convergence, and instead foregrounds contingency, showing that historical processes don't unfold according to predetermined laws or ideas of supply and demand, or technological processes, or state formation. A central contribution of her scholarship is seeing indigenous economic lives and local forms of innovation as integral to global economic systems. And while she doesn't shy away from tracing the violence of European expansion, of settlers, planters, slavers, and merchants, she also reveals the agency of those who navigated and resisted or reshaped those unequal relationships. Her work on commodities such as sugar or silver, and on the regulatory structures that govern trade and navigation, show how global connections were built from the ground up through everyday practices as much as through imperial or state design. Her approach is marked by a deep curiosity and an openness to new thinking. She's been very actively attentive to the meta-narratives that shape historical interpretations and unafraid to call out her peers when they rely on concepts that are, into her words, suggestive but perfectly empty of meaning. Don't get on her bad side. She's been very prominent in rejecting teleological stories about modernization or national progress, and instead examining states as very complex actors, sometimes acting as enforcers of property rights or fiscal regimes, sometimes monopolists, or sometimes, to borrow the phrase coined by Manke Olsen, the state as a stationary bandit. Her work, therefore, moves fluently between local, regional, and global scales. She shows how economic life was always entwined with political belonging, and how global history is not just a matter of widening the map, but of tracing the connective tissue that binds places together. This was evident from her 2012 prize-winning book, Distant Tyranny, which used the trade in dried and salted cod, bacalao, across the Atlantic to understand better the development of Spanish regions, the evolution of long-distance trade, and the very uneven processes by which markets became integrated or failed to integrate. Her research since then has done a lot to scrutinize and expand our knowledge of institutional and financial history, such as her study of credit, debt, charity, guilds, and state building across that Iberian world. By examining who could borrow, at what rates, and under what conditions, she's revealed the social and also the cultural dimensions of economic life that are more obscured in perhaps more abstract models. She's also been a major contributor to maritime history, critically vocal against overly technological explanations, so beloved by maritime historians, and instead determined to bring social and political contexts to bear on understanding seafaring worlds. In debates about globalization, she's challenged conventional periodization, offering global history contributions that chart the changing kinds of connectivity and experiences of time-space compression. Across all of this work, Professor Grafe brings a rare combination of empirical rigor, not imperial. Imperial in its delivery occasionally. Theoretical sophistication and intellectual boldness. She's engaged in debates in international relations, political science, and economics, but always grounding her evidence historically and in the cultural and ideological worlds of the past. Her arrival signals and strengthens the faculty's commitment to global, economic, and social history, already well established in the work of Gareth Austin, her predecessor in the 1928 chair of economic history. And that chair, of course, will see its centenary in 2 years' time, and we'll be celebrating the very significant work of its current and past incumbents. We are thrilled and super fortunate to have Professor Grafe join this group, expanding and enriching the field of economic history at Cambridge with her breadth, her precision, her imagination, and it's my pleasure to welcome her to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to everybody for coming. It's a little bit hard for me to imagine what I can now say additional to what Lucy just said, but let me give it a try. In the last few years, my research and teaching have centered on, as Lucy pointed out, two very large themes. On the one hand, I've become fascinated by how little we know about what we might call the financial sector in colonial Spanish America. On the other, my research has veered towards what has come to be known as a history of capitalism. And that perhaps is not unexpected, given that I'm part of the first generation of economic historians whose training was global from the start. As it turns out, colonial Spanish American history and the history of capitalism are uneasy travel companions. The history of capitalism has the great merit of reawakening the interest in economic questions in departments of history, especially in the United States. After Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy in 2008, the number of students in my economic history classes at Northwestern almost doubled. Yet, the strong roots of the history of capitalism in US history have also been criticized. There is a legitimate concern that the history of capitalism rolls back decades of work that has sought to decenter economic history away from the privileged position of the global north. Historians of colonial Spanish America, for their part, have been notably uninterested in the integration of their field into the larger debates of global history, and even more so in the history of capitalism, notwithstanding a century of critical thinking about capitalism in Latin America. I think that is a real shame, and in this lecture I will argue that we can learn a lot about capitalism from the history of colonial Spanish America, and that in turn the history of capitalism can help us to make sense of some of the less well understood developments in Spanish America. I hope to convince you that what emerged in Spanish America was a particular variety of a colonial capitalist moral economy. To be more precise, it was, by the standards of the early modern period, an economy that became, from the very start, hardwired on a very high degree of financialization. But it also became more, not less, of a moral economy over the 3 centuries of Spanish colonial hegemony. I'll begin by explaining what I mean by capitalist, financialized, and moral economy. I will then show you some snippets of how such a financialized economy worked in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then finally, I'll turn my attention to some ideas about how this all came about. Let me start by unpacking what I mean by some of those large concepts that I've just mentioned: capitalism, financialization, and moral economy. Jürgen Kocher has defined capitalism as a system characterized by decentralization, commodification, and accumulation. Decentralization because economic actors can use their property rights based on their individual decisions and in a decentralized way. Commodification because the allocation of resources, including that of labor, capital, and natural resources, takes place primarily via the market. Accumulation because resources are invested with a view to future gains, including the investment in financial activities. Kocher's description sidesteps deliberately ideologically inflected debates, and that turns it into a helpful empirical tool. One point to note is that as far as commodification of labor is concerned, wage labor and enslaved labor are both firmly part of capitalism. I use the term financialization to describe a particular facet of accumulation, quote, in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production, end of quote. Scholars like Grete Krippner, whose definition this is, use financialization to describe the history of finance since the 1970s. And yet, I will argue that colonial Spanish America was a highly financialized economy avant la lettre. It was an economy in which a very large part of productive and commercial activities were immediately transformed into financial assets and arguably subordinated to a financial logic. More than half a century ago, E.P. Thompson formulated the concept of a moral economy in his famous article on the English crowd in the 18th century. Thompson intended his contribution as a criticism to what he called the crass reductionism of growth historians, and I suspect he was talking about economic historians. In Thompson's telling, 18th century bread riots were catalyzed by what the rebellious plebs considered legitimate and illegitimate practices, quote, grounded upon a consistent traditional view of social norms and obligations, of the proper economic functions of several parties within the community, which taken together can be said to constitute the moral economy of the poor, end of quote. In that moral economy, there was a fair price of a good, which was not necessarily the same as a price that supply and demand would establish in the marketplace. Today, we would likely amend Thompson's statement slightly to the effect that the market remained a social and a cultural, as well as an economic nexus. But I'm not the first to point out that Thompson's concept unintentionally, but I think problematically, reified a notion that the economy was somehow on a march to its a less moral future of a fully capitalist 19th century. The moral economy was pre-capitalist, capitalism proper encroached on it until it broke. In the history of capitalism, that unhelpful teleology has arguably had the effect of reintroducing Eurocentrism through the back door. Sven Beckert, in his recent opus magnum, likens capitalism to the disembedding of economic life from existing social norms. There's no doubt that Beckert is fully committed to writing a history of capitalism that is global. And nevertheless, he sees the coming of capitalism as a process that had a center, Europe, from which it conquered the world. In this telling, European colonization was the harbinger of a new, less moral economic relations across the globe. I beg to differ. I don't think embeddedness is the best way to think about the moral economy to start with. But more importantly, I want to argue that in the Spanish-American colonial context, the construction of a moral economy deepened over the colonial period in a process that involved practically everyone. The economy became more moral and more Spanish-American and more capitalist all at the same time. That process began, there's no doubt, as a brutal invasion, socio-cultural dislocation, demographic collapse, the appropriation of pre-colonial indigenous institutions, and the introduction of some European institutional transplants. But in the end, it was a Spanish-American homemade colonial product, in which indigenous people and Afro-descendants were just as much involved as the erstwhile European invaders. It is very hard to overestimate the degree to which the colonial Spanish-American economy relied on credit relations. That is not a novel insight. We know this because credit agreements in Spanish America, even those involving small amounts of money, were very often formalized by notaries whose notarial records survived. You see an example of this right here, and the legally important point is, of course, that only notaries could use the stamped paper papel sellado that you see here in the image. The notarial records are also why we know that those involved in the credit economy were as diverse as one could imagine. Public and private institutions, local and regional treasuries, indigenous communities, merchants and their corporations, or hacendados, indigenous people and Afro-descendant men and women, and even enslaved people. Yet, in the economic centers of the empire, the single most important set of institutions in Spanish-American credit markets were arguably religious endowments. Convents, monasteries, confraternities, parishes, the Inquisition, and cathedral chapters all had one thing in common. They lent and borrowed money at interest all the time. That is not a novel insight either. But I'd argue that as historians of colonial Spanish America, we have yet to make sense of it. The sense-making has not so much occurred by drawing on what is in the archive than by what is not. You may have noticed an absence in my enumeration. Where were the banks? Well, there were some, but apparently they struggled to compete. Admit that they existed, as Margarita Suarez has shown for early 17th century Lima. Evidently, the legal and economic conditions for their existence were in place. They were rather like private banks in many parts of Europe during the early modern period, prone to failure because of liquidity problems. However, it matters just as much that after a few failures that were to be expected, banks were not the institutional path Spanish-American credit took. Investors stopped trying to recreate them. Notwithstanding, credit continued to become more and more ubiquitous, with or without a set of institutions that European historians would recognize as a bank. When you look at them at first sight, this all seemed a capitalist free-for-all. It was decentralized, to go back to Cocker, in that property rights were clearly assigned and transferred by individuals and institutions. There was nothing that could not be commodified. Land, capital, goods, and labor, both salaried and enslaved, could be sold, rented, or used as a lien. Future income streams from taxes, offices, or ecclesiastical prebends were sold and used as collateral. Loans could be signed over and sold over to third parties using the notaries. There was what an economic historian would call a secondary market in debt. The financial returns from these contracts formed the basis of a spectacular process of original accumulation. As Marx would have called it, original in the sense of Marx's ursprüngliche Akkumulation. That is that which is at the origin, and very different from the connotation of primitive accumulation, which is how Marx's dictum is often rendered in English. There was nothing primitive about the process of accumulation in Spanish America. And yet, I would argue that this precocious financialization was not a free-for-all. Instead, it went hand in hand with a deepening of its moral character. Lending became a moral practice, and religious institutions paved the path on which society at large followed. Christian religious institutions and canon law during the European Middle Ages provided the legal path to corporate, that is, collective rights. Religious institutions became legal personalities that could own property free from the vagaries of family inheritance in perpetuity. Just ask your college bursar. Religious endowments, time horizon, thus became theoretically eternal. Europe wasn't special in this. Similar developments occurred in other religious contexts, notably in Islam. But Spanish hegemony had elevated Catholicism to the role of the legal and moral setter of norms in colonial Spanish America. By the time of the invasion of the Americas, Iberian Catholic doctrine had long accommodated lending at interest with the help of a series of 15th century papal bulls. Interest is the price of money. Legalizing interest meant accepting that capital had a price. The initial credit instrument used in the Hispanic realms was called a censo. An interest rate ceiling for the censo was set by the monarchy, not by the church, and fell from about 10% in the 15th century to 5% in the 17th century. It was not a fixed rate, but a maximum. Any rate below the ceiling was legal under the twin concepts that compensation was warranted if the investment involved risk, damnum emergens, or if it meant the investor forewent gains in another activity, lucrum cessans, so basically what the modern economist calls opportunity cost. Into the 16th century, the censo was camouflaged as a compraventa, as you will see here. The buyer-lender bought a regular periodical return from the seller-borrower, which was expressed as a fixed amount of the loan, such as 20,000 for 1,000, 20,000 al millar. The buyer-lender had to hand over 20,000 to receive an annual return of 1,000, which of course is 5%. It was a perpetual loan, generally secured against land or real property. We could call it a mortgage, and could only be dissolved if the borrower decided to repay the principal. It is often likened to the so-called 5% loan that existed in large parts of post-Reformation Protestant Europe. But as I mentioned, the interest rate was not fixed in the Hispanic realms. Starting from these humble origins as a censo, from the 17th century onwards, early 17th century actually, a large variety of contracts began to appear in Spanish America. Credit conditions began to vary drastically. Sometimes they were still called a censo, but a cast of new contracts appeared too. By the 18th century, shorter loans were known as obligaciones, reconocimientos, enfiteosis, cesión de deuda, depósitos irregulares, and by various other names. These could be collateralized or not by real property, a guarantor, or anything else. I have come across a mule as a surety, and I do wonder if that is the first car loan in history. But, you could use anything you had. They had shorter or longer durations, were subscribed by individuals, more than one person, compañías, and involved people of any ethnicity, gender, or corporate status, including the enslaved. In short, the notaries of Spanish America had evidently developed significant creativity to uphold what was presented to them on a notary's papel sellado, notarial stamped paper. In his wonderful brand new account of the making of the capitalist self in England, our colleague Craig Muldrew has documented how early modern English publications increasingly separated the idea of self-love and interest from the notion of usury. Craig's very careful analysis draws on all sorts of diverse sources, but one of them are two major online repositories of English publications, the early English books online and the 18th century collections online. And Craig shows that mentions of the word usury fell from about 7% in the second half of the 16th century to 3% in the first half of the 18th century. Now, he will be quick to tell you that the total number increased, but the percentage of this decreased over time, right? Slowly but steadily, concerns about usury receded. Unfortunately, I cannot replicate his work for Spanish America because there are no comparable databases of publications. However, there is an outstanding, really outstanding online catalogue of the extremely rich Archive of the Indies in Seville, which contains more than 40,000 legajos files. Every few months, over the past 3 years, I have been repeating a search for the term usury for the entire colonial period from 1492 to 1800. Last week, it brought up 12 documents. Now, if you must make a percentage of that, that's about 0.03%. But, let's not interpret this too strictly. My point is the silence speaks volumes, even if the evidence is anecdotal. Usury was simply not an argument that made it into the legal, administrative, or economic documentation of the empire. There are a few documents, mostly in the early 16th century. After that, the archive falls silent. For all I can tell, it was a non-issue in Spanish American real life from the start. That makes it less surprising that cases in which notarized credit contracts were deemed outside the law by judges were rare, even when a strict interpretation of the law would have suggested that they were. I've come across a small number of such loans that were questioned because they involved people who were deemed unable to act as responsible individuals, such as minors. Others involved particular corporate categories, such as members of the militias and the nobility, and I'll come back to this last point below. But on the whole, as long as the two parties had signed in the presence of a notary, the contract was upheld. One element that propelled this credit economy was that coined money was so much easier to come by in Spanish America. During much of the colonial period, more than half of the world's silver came from Peru. You see here a famous image of the rich mountain of Potosí, Cerro Rico, and from Mexico. Since the 1530s, the world's most important currency, the peso, consisting of 8 reales and the smaller coins, there are 1 real, so you need 8 of those to get a peso, was minted in the Americas. In Europe, oral and paper credit, as Craig will tell you, often simply served to overcome the lack of hard currency. That was much less of an issue in Spanish America. Estimates for the share that religious institutions had in the flourishing credit markets are hard to come by. Somewhat heroic approximations have argued that in the core economic centers of the viceroyalties of New Spain, which is Mexico and Peru, 2/3 of the credit was extended by religious institutions. Be that as it may, the activities of these institutions were certainly representative of the workings of the financial market, even if they were just the richest of the many. So I will look at their records for a moment to explain how the financial market worked, to the best of my ability. For religious institutions, lending at interest was not just legal, but it became a moral obligation. They were increasingly obligated by their own rules to invest at profit. Bishoprics and higher ranks of the orders controlled that money was invested in safe real and financial assets. Women's convents in particular had to present a credible investment plan for any new foundation. Their possibilities for gainful economic employment were more limited than those of the men's orders, who were expected to be employed in the mission and teaching. Nuns, by contrast, ought to serve society through their praise and contemplation, which meant they needed financial income to support them. Religious confraternities and brotherhoods all over the Spanish American colonies, too, began to explicitly define what it meant to be a moral investor. Here you have an example from late 18th century Mexico, which obliged the officers of the Confraternity of the Rosary not only to sound financial management, they were told to invest any carryovers in valuable properties. We're not told if there's a preference for real or financial property here, so that the capital and interest would pay for the charitable activities of the Brotherhood. Those charitable activities comprised most of the welfare that members could count on in their hour of need, from incapacity to death. Yet it could also mean confraternal activities such as the rearing of a herd of cattle for the shared benefit of the members, the purchase and renting of property or land, the acquisition of devotional objects, which could double as a store of value for the corporation, and religious sociability. Making money for the common good was not just morally acceptable, it was a Christian duty. The logic of financial endowments, past and present, is to create a steady stream of income from assets that are considered safe. For that purpose, all sources of income were ideally financialized. For institutional investors, as we would call them today, it is cumbersome and costly to actively manage diverse activities in trade, manufacturing, agriculture. It is much easier to transform the income derived from such activities into fixed monetary rent, payable at regular intervals. For poor confraternities, investments in small, moderate loans were more feasible than the acquisition of large pieces of land. The investment portfolio of the largest endowments, often women's convents, Jesuits, colleges, or the tribunals of the Inquisition, combined urban real estate with agricultural estates and purely financial transactions. The ability with which colonial Spanish Americans transformed all economic activity into financial streams built directly on a rich European heritage of providing for prebends and ecclesiastical incomes. Yet the finances of large European religious institutions were much more tied to landed wealth and its proceeds in cash and kind. The sheer scale of the use of financialized income derived by Spanish American Catholic institutions from plain and simple lending was by contrast on a completely different level. But again, it was not just the religious institutions that engaged in lending and borrowing. From the 1570s, indigenous communities in Peru, for example, had their own collective funds, which they invested in loans. Financial innovation happened mostly on paper, and religious institutions, however, were often at the creative edge. So let me talk you through one example and hopefully explain it well. A Jesuit college in Lima turned 3 one-off donations into a financial instrument. A donation of 16,500 pesos had been given in 1702 by Don Francisco Ramírez de los Olivos. It was topped up with 2 smaller donations made by Father Juan de la Serna and Miguel de Bobadilla in 1724. The donations mentioned specifically the support for the missionary activity of the college friars on the coast in a town called Ica and in the highlands in Charcas, which is today Bolivia. The money itself was immediately converted into endowment, which then lent the money back to the Jesuit college via a censo. In this case, the annual interest rate was charged at 4%, in the case of the larger donation, 5% in the smaller ones, and the interest rates are spelled out. They long got rid of this very cumbersome way of expressing interest they used earlier. Now, the annual interest of this loan, which theoretically, or at least legally, was taken out by the college from the endowment it had given the money to itself. So the annual interest was paid to the specific endowment by the Jesuit college was used to send a yearly mission to each of these missionary posts, Ica and Charcas. In this case, the missions gained additional support via what we could call matching funds in cash and kind. The neighboring Jesuit college of El Callao had, in a similar operation, committed to contributing 100 pesos each year and to lend, free of charge, one enslaved African and a few mules that he would guide. In one of the missionary posts, on top of everything else, the friars could pay for their own sustenance thanks to yet another censo, which the college had set up in that town. So, in short, fortified by their faith in 5 censos, a couple of mules, and the services of an enslaved man in the property of a neighboring college, the Jesuits undertook their missionary journeys religiously from 1702 to 1751, when their traces are lost in the archive. While the exact conditions of such contracts could vary, the example, I think, serves to illustrate the principle of turning donations and nuns' dowries into a regular monetized income stream. As investment built on investment, the principles accumulated year after year, and more money was lent at lower and lower interest rates. Some of it would be turned into credits for the institution itself and finance its expenditures and salaries, as seen in this example. Most would be turned into loans to the owners of agricultural haciendas, manufacturing establishments, commercial activities, and to the public treasury. Convents lent to each other, transferring money from places like Lima, where the financial market was liquid, to regions in the south of Peru, in the highlands, or in far-away Chile, where capital could be scarce. The Jesuits were somewhat exceptional, though, in that they, more often than other religious institutions in Spanish America, did run their own agricultural establishments. And as landowners, they also invested significant parts of the proceeds in enslaved labor. By the time of the expulsion from Spanish America in 1767, that had turned them into the largest corporate slaveholder in Spanish America. As in all slaveholding societies, the bodies of the enslaved became an important financial asset. When the colonial authorities began to auction off Jesuit properties, after the expulsion, private and other religious investors eagerly picked up the buildings, the haciendas, credit business, and especially the enslaved sold in the largest collective sale in Spanish America to that date. By the 18th century, the original accumulation of religious endowments of all kinds had driven down interest rates well below the legal limit to rates that sometimes went as low as 2%. A pioneering study by Asunción Lavrin, reworked by Gisela von Bobecer, of the 10 richest convents of Mexico City in the mid-18th century found that their investment portfolios consisted of about 2/3 of mostly urban properties, including the convent's buildings, and 1/3 between short-term and long-term loans. The property of the richest convent was about 1 million pesos, an absolutely astronomical sum. At this point, religious institutions and their accumulated wealth had not only become the backbone of many sectors of the economy, but of the colonial administration and its royal treasury. Between 1776 and the early 1780s, the royal treasury in Lima faced the double challenge of an external and an internal crisis. The external crisis was the Portuguese invasion of Spanish-controlled territories in the River Plate. The internal crisis was the largest ever indigenous uprising in the Andes, the Tupac Amaru rebellion. To meet these challenges, the Lima treasury needed money fast. And 133 investors responded to the call. They offered 1.5 million pesos at 3% per annum, a decent rate of return on investment in late colonial Peru. A rare surviving list, of which you see a snapshot here, of investors shows that half of the subscribers of the loan were religious institutions and individuals, the other half were locals from all walks of life. 1/3 of the capital was controlled by women, religious and lay. The smallest subscription was a modest 500 pesos, the largest amounted to 130,000 pesos, suggesting that the subscriber, the Congregación de Nuestra Señora de O, was probably just as wealthy as the richest convent in Mexico. This snapshot of 18 investors you see here contains 8 monasteries, mostly women's, 3 wealthy nuns, a priest, 4 individuals, and 2 large investments by the Inquisition, which by the 18th century ran some of the largest investment funds in the Americas. Let us return for a minute to where we started, namely with the definition of capitalism and financialization. If capitalism is about decentralized decision-making about property rights, the commodification and market exchange of most everything, including labor, and a drive to invest with a view to accumulate in the future, then I hope I convinced you that colonial Spanish America was capitalist. If financialization implies that productive processes of all kinds are more often than not transformed into financial income streams, we can equally, I think, now call the colonial economy a place of precocious financialization. Yet economic history is not an exercise in checking boxes. I started this talk wanting to understand the transformations and processes that brought about the remarkable degree to which the colonial Spanish-American economy was capitalist and financialized. And I claimed that the gestation of a negotiated moral economy was an integral part of that. So for what is left of my time, I want to discuss a few instances in which those negotiation processes within colonial society become visible. One way to look for how precocious financialization contributed to the making of a colonial moral economy is to ask how society established what could be sold, borrowed, or generally commodified, and at what price. In the post-invasion society of colonial Spanish America, the fundamental questions about property rights were not obvious. Indigenous concepts of rights of use had been established in centuries of customary roots. Yet they also differed significantly among indigenous polities. Spanish law brought its own customary and Roman law rules, but it also incorporated indigenous forms of access rights and imposed what the new hegemons imagined to be customary indigenous property rights. Sometimes the two coincided, sometimes not. In short, what and who could be commodified was not straightforward. It helps to take a step back and wonder how European or maybe Eurasian cultures established property. Katharina Pistor usefully breaks this down into 2 elements: the actual object and the legal coding of the object as property. A house, a piece of land, a good, a coin, or a person for that matter, is transformed into a property or an economic asset in European cultures only once a legal code is attached to it. Hence, the ownership of a house in colonial Lima was established by its legal coding. Without that, a resident could have squatted in it, but would not have owned it. Only ownership allowed her to use it. The legal term is, of course, usos, or rent it out, usus fructus, or dispose of it, abusos. In Spanish America, ownership meant that there was somewhere a notarial contract affirming the property right. That is why indigenous communities, for example, very quickly began to ask for notarial confirmation of their ancestral lands. Without the legal coding, there were no property rights. And without property rights, there was no financialization. Thinking about property rights in this way allows us to break the larger issue down into questions that we can actually answer. How and by whom were the physical and human assets coded? And how and by whom were they contested? The by whom is particularly important because this was a capitalism in which not all market participants were equal. In a pre-modern society of orders, the upholding of inequality and hierarchies between groups was just as important as the notion that there was a market price that depended on supply and demand, as Francesca Trivellato has recently reminded us in a special issue on the moral economy. Society affirmed both an individual's contractual freedom, what we could call the decentralization based on people's use of the property rights, and status-bound inequality. A contract should reflect the fair value of the goods exchanged or the loan agreed as established by the market. But it also reflected the differences in status between those who had freely agreed on the contract. Contracts between a man and a woman, a military officer and an indigenous cacique, an enslaved African and her employer, were never contracts between equals. And yet, they did respond to market prices. The tension was never meant to be resolved. It was part of how society worked. Pre-modern European societies of order were, of course, not immutable, but their long-term stability contrasted starkly with the instability of corporate categories in colonial Spanish America. Here, corporate social status and markets developed in parallel. Societies' gendered, ethnic, and corporate differences evolved simultaneously with the credit markets I described to you. Alongside, not only goods were coded, but also people, often at the very same time. In Spanish America, indigenous people became coded as unenslavable, Africans as enslavable, with enormous consequences for both groups. A lot has been written about the moral and religious debates that led to the famous new laws of 1542, which coded indigenous people as free. The religious and moral underpinnings of the laws were very important. However, as I've discussed elsewhere, for a full century between 1495 and 1592, the monarchy and its subjects in the Americas were engaged in an intense debate about how exactly the indigenous would be legally coded. That implied a definition of the limits of the rights of the indigenous, or what is the same, the rights of the Spanish elites to the persons and the labor of the indigenous. The most important collection of royal decrees for the colonial period contains 67 separate decrees over a century, which discussed the question of indigenous freedom. Almost exactly half of them were issued in the 5 decades before the laws of 1542, and half issued in the half century thereafter. Spanish colonial decrees are interesting because they can often be read literally as one side of a correspondence between the American subjects of the empire and the Council of the Indies. The royal decrees often restate the proposals for a decree that they actually received from the colonies. They then convey the decision of the Council of the Indies in Spain to adopt those proposals or not. The next decree tells you if and why the colonial authorities then refused to accept the previous decision. And sometimes it took at least 67 decrees over a century before the contours of the decision became clear, as was the case in the question of indigenous liberty. I would argue these royal decrees are a record of legal coding as it happened. My point is that the question of who coded property rights in colonial Spanish America is surprisingly complex. What we might anachronistically call the legislative initiative very often came from the Americas, often from the Spanish civil and ecclesiastical authorities, but occasionally also from indigenous authorities and from those of free blacks. The location of power, as I've called it, was surprisingly dispersed. And in that sense, the legal coding of property and persons in Spanish America was a process in which many participated. Let us go back to the question of credit and its consequences one last time to see the legal coding in the colonial society of orders in the making. The time and place is Santiago de Chile in 1711. These were the southern fringes of the empire, far away from the bustling credit markets of the viceregal capitals of Mexico and Lima. Here, the interest rate ceiling still mattered because capital was scarcer. The aldermen of the city came together to ask the Council of the Indies for an important legal change. They wanted a reduction of the legal interest rate ceiling on standard loans from 5 to 3%. They may have heard somewhere that the legal interest rate ceiling had actually been lowered in part of the Spanish Peninsula. They claimed they had heard that it had been lowered in Lima, but that was actually not true. They made that up. What they were asking for was nothing short of a partial expropriation of the lenders and a transfer of the rights to the borrowers. But what interests us here is how they justified such a request to recode property. Their reasoning, or shall we call it their lament, is worth quoting. Nothing and no house or inheritance can be maintained for the sons and the grandsons of those who first settled and pacified these lands, because of continuous evictions that the convents and monasteries try to execute. The principles of the loans increase day after day. And because the life of man is temporal and those burdens are eternal, the loans keep on increasing. The aldermen came from the families that saw themselves as the original conquistadors of Chile. They ran agricultural estates and reminded the council of that they organized the defensive militias. Yet their indignation ran deeper than just feeling that as descendants of conquistadores, they deserved better. They went on to describe how they had to live permanently on their rural haciendas because they could not afford to maintain their houses in the city. More than anything else, they voiced their frustration with the nuns, to whom they owed so much money that it was almost equivalent to the total of the value of their properties. Not content with leaving the elite's male heirs in penury and dependent on the convents, the nuns had also raised the dowries for their daughters, that their daughters had to pay when entering the convent. Frustratingly, not sending one of your daughters to a convent was not an option because it meant losing access to credit. The men of the town council did not question that they had signed those censos. There was no suggestion that the convents had done anything illegal. The aldermen evidently knew that the courts would uphold their debt obligations. Yet in their telling, the accumulated debt upset everything else in colonial society. Spanish elite families had to live in rural areas inhabited mostly by the indigenous. The convents dominated the town. Men lost their property to women. Militia leaders were commanded around by nuns. Debt was eternal. Men were mortal, and financialisation had upended the colonial order. Property rights had to be recoded. Or so the aldermen thought. The nuns naturally saw the matter differently. They stressed their legal rights to the interest payments and the service they had rendered to all economic activities in Santiago by extending credit. Not surprisingly, they emphasized their contribution to moral and religious life and the care for the novices and sisters. In short, they had invested carefully and needed those interest payments to keep up their contribution to colonial society. Property rights should not be recoded. In the event, I can tell you the nuns won the argument in 1718. But more than the result, the episode is fascinating, I think, because it shows the contestation over the legal coding of rights in practice. On this occasion, the nuns mostly relied on the argument that supply and demand for credit had worked well. They had accumulated wealth and invested it at interest as they should. Financialisation was serving its purpose. The aldermen wielded arguments of collective social status against this. The widespread indebtedness affected elite men and threatened their role within their families and society. It was not a problem of individual contracts they had signed. It was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed by a blanket recalibration of economic power to match colonial social status, even if that ran against the perfectly legitimate outcome of supply and demand in credit markets. The colonial American archives are full of such instances of haggling between colonial actors and between the colonies and the colonial authorities over the property rights in financial markets and very much markets for everything else. Sometimes legal interventions changed the course of history, especially in the early colonial period. In the later 16th century, the monarchy and the religious orders wrangled over the location of religious houses. The orders had acquired land and settled in indigenous villages and bought rural estates. But the monarchy wanted them to live in poverty and be an example for indigenous neophytes. But poverty was not something most orders were willing to contemplate. Thus, they moved their property holdings into the urban areas. That is likely one reason why religious endowments became so urban-focused during the entire colonial period. Their urban location, in turn, reinforced the tendency to its financial investments. The aldermen of Santiago de Chile knew everything about that. The relative scarcity of convents outside towns, however, may also have contributed to indigenous people in rural areas becoming even earlier active participants in the credit economy and potential competitors of the religious credit givers. As Laura León Llerena has shown, from the later 16th century onwards, church texts that regulated and supported the teaching of Christianity made a concerted effort to explain economic life to the indigenous so as to enable them to obey the colonial order. They were told to honor their priest, even if he was greedy. They should not waste their money on non-Christian sorcerers, and instead presumably pay their greedy priest. Most importantly, these texts did invoke usury to tell the indigenous that they should not lend at interest. As León Llerena points out, in a world in which Catholic endowments were often the main lenders, discouraging indigenous from participating in the credit economy as lenders was simply a way to try and discourage the competition. Or as I have framed it, a blatant attempt to recode the property rights of the indigenous. That the ecclesiastical authorities felt nervous about indigenous agency in the credit sector as early as the 1580s suggests that in this case, the church was fighting a losing battle over who was in charge of the coding of property rights. It shows yet again how financialization occasionally served to upend the colonial society of orders in Spanish America. To conclude, if nothing else, I hope I have convinced you that the colonial Spanish Spanish-American economy was fascinating. As Spanish hegemony was established, it was not simply subjected to European capitalism, and it did not become less of a moral economy over the 3 centuries of colonial rule. Yes, it owed the origins of its intense financialization to Iberian precedents. And the fact that colonial society could from early on rely on the availability of stable money. Yet everything else was remarkably unstable. In that context, it is even more remarkable that it became so hardwired to financialization very early on. Like all pre-modern economies, it was characterized by this tension between free contracting and the social status of corporate groups. Unlike European societies, the status boundaries themselves needed to be defined over time, and the legal coding of what and who could be commodified had to be established almost from scratch. The deep involvement of the religious endowments in the financial market served to uphold the colonial order, not least because it supported the obligatory conversion of millions of indigenous people to Christianity and the original accumulation of capital that was at the roots of the expansion of the colonial state and economy. Yet, as we've seen, the relationship between financialisation and the colonial order was also ambiguous. I've suggested that paying attention to the haggling over financialised property rights is one way to disentangle the complexity of the making of the colonial moral economy. The aldermen of Santiago de Chile attempted to use a legal recoding of property in the name of the colonial order. The nuns rejected it with reference to free contracting and also to the stability of the colonial order. This was not Thompson's plebs revolting. It was elites working disharmoniously on the moral economy. The use of financialisation by indigenous and black Spanish Americans, too, resulted in significant changes in how property was coded. Many of these legal codes, as I've called them, took a long time to settle, only to be then overthrown by independence. But that's another story.